The hum of the engines filled the cabin as Declan O'Shea adjusted his seat in the cockpit, his jaw tightening with every minor vibration that rattled through the plane. He hated days like this. Storm warnings, rerouted flight paths, and corporate suits breathing down his neck over fuel costs. His calloused hands moved instinctively over the controls, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying arguments he'd had with superiors who didn't understand what it meant to fly in these conditions. Outside, dark clouds loomed ominously, their edges glowing faintly with distant lightning. Declan muttered under his breath, "Bloody amateurs," while Captain Sarah Hayes glanced at him sideways, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his simmering frustration. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was equally tense. A nervous businessman tapped incessantly on his laptop, glancing up occasionally at the flickering reading lights above him. Across the aisle, a young mother tried to soothe her crying toddler, her patience wearing thin as turbulence jostled the plane. Near the back, an older woman clutched her rosary beads tightly, muttering prayers under her breath. The flight attendants moved methodically through the aisles, their practiced smiles masking any unease they might have felt. Among them was Liam Carter, whose quiet efficiency seemed almost too deliberate. He avoided eye contact with passengers, focusing instead on securing loose items in the overhead compartments. When one passenger asked for a blanket, Liam's response was polite but clipped, his attention clearly divided. As Declan monitored the weather systems on his screen, his thoughts drifted to earlier flights where his temper had gotten the better of him. If only they'd listen to me once in a while, he thought bitterly, recalling heated exchanges with ground staff about safety protocols. He prided himself on knowing every procedure by heart, though no one else seemed to appreciate it. Back then, he'd been labeled difficult, reckless even, but deep down he knew his instincts were rarely wrong. Still, it didn't stop the weight of responsibility from pressing heavily on his shoulders. If anything went wrong today, it would be on him, and he couldn't afford another mistake. Meanwhile, Liam worked his way toward the rear galley, his movements precise but hurried. Beneath his composed exterior, however, lay a growing sense of dread. Hidden inside a small metallic case tucked into an overhead bin was something he shouldn't have brought aboard, a volatile chemical compound smuggled under duress. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if someone found it? What if it reacted unexpectedly during the flight? He shook off the thoughts, reminding himself that this job was supposed to be simple. Deliver the package undetected and disappear. But as the plane hit another patch of turbulence, sending coffee cups sliding across trays, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. Liam Carter moved through the narrow aisle with practiced ease, his polished demeanor belying the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. The passengers barely noticed him as he passed, their attention consumed by books, phones, or the occasional nervous glance out the window at the thickening storm clouds. But Liam's focus wasn't on them. It was on the metallic case tucked securely in the overhead compartment near the rear galley. Every time the plane shuddered from turbulence, his stomach clenched tighter, imagining the worst possible outcome. What if it shifts? What if it breaks? He tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. In the cockpit, Declan's irritation grew with each passing minute. The turbulence was worse than forecasted, and the constant chatter over the radio about rerouting options grated on his nerves. "Why don't they just let me do my job?" he muttered under his breath, his fingers drumming impatiently on the control panel. Captain Hayes shot him another sidelong glance but said nothing, her calm silence only fueling his frustration further. Declan hated feeling powerless, especially when lives depended on his decisions. His mind drifted back to Liam earlier that morning during pre-flight checks, how the man had seemed distracted, almost evasive when asked about cabin readiness. Something about him didn't sit right, though Declan couldn't quite put his finger on it. Back in the cabin, Liam's unease became more apparent as he struggled to maintain his composure. When a passenger accidentally bumped into him while retrieving a bag, he flinched visibly, earning a curious look from the woman beside him. "You all right there?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. Liam forced a smile, nodding quickly before excusing himself and retreating to the galley. There he leaned against the counter, closing his eyes for a moment as he steadied his breathing. Just a few more hours, he told himself, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. Then this will all be over. But even as he tried to reassure himself, doubt crept in. He'd been warned not to open the case under any circumstances, yet its presence alone felt like a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, the storm outside intensified, sending shockwaves through the aircraft. Passengers exchanged worried glances as the lights flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. The older woman clutching her rosary beads began whispering louder prayers, her voice trembling slightly. Nearby, the businessman stopped typing mid-sentence, staring blankly at his screen as if trying to process what might happen next. Even the toddler, who had finally quieted down, started whimpering again, sensing the collective anxiety around her. It was as if the entire plane held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the mounting tension. Declan felt it too, though he refused to show it. His instincts screamed that something was off, not just with the weather, but with the flight itself. He glanced at the clock, noting how much longer they had until descent. Too long, he thought grimly. And then there was Liam. Declan couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that the flight attendant was hiding something. Earlier, he'd caught a glimpse of Liam securing something in the overhead bin, a metallic object that gleamed faintly before disappearing behind the latch. At the time, he'd dismissed it as irrelevant, but now, with the turbulence worsening and the passengers growing restless, he found himself questioning everything. As the plane hit another rough patch, Declan decided enough was enough. If Liam was cutting corners on safety protocols, or worse, he needed answers, and he needed them now. Pushing himself up from his seat, Declan signaled to Captain Hayes that he'd be stepping out momentarily. She nodded without comment, leaving him to navigate the swaying aisle toward the rear of the plane. Each step brought him closer to the source of his unease. Though he couldn't have predicted just how explosive the confrontation would become, Declan's boots thudded heavily against the vibrating floor of the aisle as he made his way toward the rear galley. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The turbulence had worsened, and the plane bucked like an untamed beast, throwing passengers into a collective state of panic. A man in a business suit gripped the armrests of his seat, knuckles white, while a mother tried desperately to calm her wailing child. Declan ignored them all, his focus laser-sharp on one person, Liam Carter. He found him hunched over in the galley, fiddling with something inside an overhead compartment, his movements hurried and furtive. "What the hell are you doing back here?" Declan barked, his voice cutting through the din of rattling trays and nervous murmurs. Liam froze, his hand still hovering near the metallic case. For a split second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights before snapping the compartment shut and turning to face Declan. "Just securing some loose items," he said, his tone overly casual but betrayed by the slight tremor in his voice. Declan wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his towering frame filling the narrow space and forcing Liam to take a step back. "Loose items? In this kind of weather? Don't give me that rubbish." His sharp green eyes scanned Liam's face, searching for cracks in the mask of composure. "You've been acting strange since we boarded. What aren't you telling me?" The accusation hung heavy in the air between them, thickened by the oppressive hum of the engines and the groaning metal of the aircraft. Liam opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly weighing his options. Declan didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he reached past Liam and yanked open the overhead compartment, revealing the small metallic case nestled among emergency equipment. "What is this?" he demanded, snatching it out before Liam could protest. The case was heavier than it looked, its surface cool and smooth under Declan's calloused fingers. He turned it over, examining it closely, his suspicion growing with every passing second. "Put that down!" Liam snapped, lunging forward in a rare display of aggression. Declan instinctively pulled the case away, his temper flaring at Liam's sudden defensiveness. "Don't tell me what to do on my own bloody plane," he shot back, his voice rising above the chaos around them. Passengers nearby began to notice the escalating confrontation, craning their necks to see what was happening. Some whispered nervously, others stared openly, their fear morphing into morbid curiosity. The tension crackled like static electricity, ready to ignite at any moment. Before either man could say another word, the plane hit a particularly violent patch of turbulence, sending both of them stumbling backward. Declan managed to steady himself against the wall, but Liam lost his footing entirely, crashing into the edge of the counter. The impact jarred the case from Declan's grip, and it tumbled to the floor with a sickening thud. The latch popped open upon impact, releasing a faint green vapor that curled lazily into the air. Time seemed to freeze as both men stared at the slowly spreading cloud, their faces pale with shock. What? What is that? Declan stammered, his earlier anger replaced by pure dread. Liam didn't answer immediately, his wide eyes locked on the growing plume of gas. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the panicked cries of passengers who had noticed the strange phenomenon. "It's nothing," he lied weakly, though his trembling hands gave him away. Declan grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close until their faces were inches apart. "Nothing? That doesn't look like nothing," he growled, his grip tightening with each syllable. "What have you brought onto my plane?" By now, the entire cabin was aware that something was terribly wrong. The green vapor began to spread faster, creeping along the ceiling and seeping into the aisles. Passengers scrambled to cover their mouths and noses with scarves or sleeves, coughing as the acrid smell reached them. The older woman clutching her rosary beads let out a strangled cry, pointing frantically at the expanding cloud. "Is that smoke? Are we on fire?" someone shouted, their voice cracking with panic. Chaos erupted as people stood up, desperate to escape whatever danger loomed ahead, only to be thrown back into their seats by another jolt of turbulence. Declan released Liam with a shove, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. Whatever the substance was, it wasn't normal, and neither was Liam's behavior. "Get Captain Hayes on the intercom. Now," he ordered sharply, already moving toward the cockpit. But Liam hesitated, rooted to the spot as guilt and fear warred across his features. Declan turned back, his expression hardening. "This isn't over," he warned, jabbing a finger in Liam's direction before disappearing down the aisle. Behind him, the green vapor continued to spread, its presence ominous and unrelenting, a silent harbinger of the catastrophe yet to come. The green vapor snaked through the cabin like a living thing, curling around seatbacks and pooling in the aisles as panicked passengers scrambled to distance themselves from its creeping advance. Declan moved quickly, his boots thudding against the vibrating floor, as he pushed past hysterical travelers who were now shouting questions no one could answer. "Stay calm," he barked over his shoulder, though his own voice betrayed the tension tightening his chest. The acrid smell of the gas stung his nostrils, and he instinctively pulled the collar of his shirt up over his nose, his mind racing to piece together what was happening. He reached the cockpit door just as Captain Hayes appeared, her face pale but composed. "What's going on out there?" she demanded, her eyes darting toward the chaos behind him. Declan didn't waste time with explanations. "We've got some kind of chemical reaction spreading through the cabin," he said tersely, stepping inside and slamming the door shut behind them. "It came from a case Liam was carrying. Don't ask me why he had it, but it's bad. Really bad." His hands flew to the controls, scanning the readouts for any anomalies that might explain the sudden drop in cabin pressure. The altimeter showed they were still at cruising altitude, but the oxygen levels were fluctuating erratically. Declan cursed under his breath, his photographic memory kicking into overdrive as he mentally sifted through emergency protocols. He'd never encountered anything like this before, but he knew one thing for certain. If they didn't act fast, the situation would spiral out of control. Back in the cabin, the panic had reached a fever pitch. Passengers screamed and shoved each other in their desperation to move away from the expanding cloud, which now glowed faintly in the dim overhead lighting. The nervous businessman abandoned his laptop, clawing at the armrests as he tried to steady himself during another violent jolt of turbulence. Nearby, the mother cradled her toddler close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances neither of them believed. Even the older woman clutching her rosary beads had stopped praying, her lips trembling silently as she stared at the glowing vapor with wide, unblinking eyes. "Is this how we die?" someone wailed, their voice cracking under the weight of sheer terror. Liam stood frozen near the galley, watching helplessly as the disaster he'd unwittingly unleashed unfolded around him. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving only raw guilt and fear in its place. This wasn't supposed to happen, he thought desperately, his hands shaking as he pressed them against his mouth to keep from vomiting. The warnings he'd been given about the package echoed in his mind. Do not open it. Do not let it react. But it was too late now. Whatever was inside the case had already begun to destabilize, and there was no way to stop it. A young flight attendant approached him, her face streaked with tears. "What do we do?" she pleaded, grabbing his arm. Liam shook his head mutely, unable to form words. In the cockpit, Declan worked furiously, his movements precise despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Sarah, get on the radio and alert ground control," he ordered, his voice sharp but controlled. "Tell them we're declaring an emergency and need immediate clearance to descend." Captain Hayes nodded, her fingers flying over the communication panel as static crackled in response. Declan turned his attention back to the instruments, calculating the safest descent trajectory, while trying to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at his gut. If they dropped too quickly, they risked structural damage, or worse, losing control entirely. But if they stayed at this altitude much longer, the chemical reaction could compromise the entire aircraft. As Declan adjusted the throttle and began a gradual descent, the plane shuddered violently, throwing both pilots against their harnesses. Alarms blared, red warning lights flashing across the dashboard like strobes. "Cabin pressure's dropping faster than expected," Sarah reported, her voice strained as she fought to maintain her composure. Declan gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. "We don't have a choice," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If we don't get lower, that gas will eat through whatever's left of our oxygen supply." He glanced at the altimeter again, willing the numbers to change faster. Outside, the storm clouds churned ominously, lightning illuminating the darkness in brief, jagged bursts. Meanwhile, the passengers' hysteria reached a breaking point. A man near the front of the plane lunged toward the emergency exit, screaming about needing fresh air. Two flight attendants wrestled him back into his seat, their voices trembling as they urged everyone to remain calm. The green vapor continued to spread, its glow intensifying as it consumed more of the cabin. It seemed alive, almost sentient, feeding off the fear and chaos it had created. The mother holding her child began to sob uncontrollably, rocking back and forth as if trying to shield her daughter from the inevitable. Even the skeptical businessman who had spent most of the flight glued to his work now clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Liam finally snapped out of his paralysis, realizing he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the galley wall, hoping against hope that it might neutralize the gas, or at least slow its progress. But when he aimed the nozzle and pulled the trigger, the foam did nothing to stop the glowing plume. Instead, the vapor seemed to react violently, hissing and bubbling where the foam touched it. Liam stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a passenger who had collapsed onto the floor, coughing violently. "Help us!" the man wheezed, his face flushed and sweating. Liam hesitated, torn between guilt and self-preservation. Before he could decide what to do next, the plane hit another patch of turbulence, sending everyone sprawling. Declan felt every jolt in the cockpit, his heart pounding as he struggled to keep the aircraft stable. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, willing the plane to respond. Beside him, Captain Hayes relayed updates to ground control, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "They're clearing airspace for us," she announced, relief flickering briefly in her eyes. Declan nodded grimly, knowing they weren't out of danger yet. The descent was working. The cabin pressure was stabilizing slightly, but the chemical reaction showed no signs of slowing. If anything, it was accelerating, eating away at the plane's systems with alarming speed. Through the cockpit window, Declan caught glimpses of the storm below, its swirling mass a stark reminder of the peril they faced. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the darkened cabin beyond the cockpit door. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the worst-case scenario: the plane breaking apart mid-air, the passengers screaming as they plummeted toward the earth. He shook off the thought immediately, focusing instead on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt. Not now, not when so many lives depended on him. With a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the controls and prepared for the fight of his life. Declan's mind raced as he scanned the cockpit instruments, his photographic memory piecing together fragments of emergency protocols he'd memorized years ago, but never thought he'd need. The altimeter showed they were descending steadily, but the cabin pressure continued to fluctuate dangerously, and the chemical reaction was wreaking havoc on the plane's systems. Warning lights blinked incessantly, their red glow reflecting off the sweat beading on Declan's forehead. "We're losing hydraulic pressure," Captain Hayes reported, her voice tight with strain as she monitored the gauges. Declan didn't respond immediately. His focus was laser-sharp on the controls, his hands moving instinctively as he adjusted the throttle and rudder to compensate for the turbulence. "Think, damn it," he urged himself, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of calculations and contingencies. In the passenger cabin, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The green vapor had spread further, now filling nearly half the aircraft, its eerie glow casting long shadows across terrified faces. Passengers coughed violently, their breathing labored as the air grew thinner and more toxic. A man near the rear collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest, while others screamed for help that wasn't coming. The flight attendants did what they could, distributing oxygen masks and trying to keep people calm, but their efforts felt futile against the overwhelming sense of doom. Even Liam, who had been frantically attempting to contain the gas, realized there was nothing left to do but brace for the worst. He slumped against the galley wall, his shoulders sagging under the weight of guilt and despair. "This is my fault," he thought bitterly, tears streaming down his face as he watched the chaos unfold around him. Back in the cockpit, Declan's internal monologue was a torrent of frustration and determination. "If only I hadn't let my temper get the better of me earlier," he thought, recalling his confrontation with Liam. But regret wouldn't save them now. His eyes darted to the manual stored beneath his seat. Emergency procedures he knew by heart but needed to double-check for anything he might have missed. "Sarah, grab the manual for chemical contamination," he instructed sharply, his voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms. Captain Hayes complied without hesitation, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. "Here," she said, pointing to a section on volatile substances. Declan skimmed the text quickly, his mind absorbing the information like a sponge. "We need to reduce cabin temperature," he muttered, already reaching for the environmental controls. "Cold slows reactions. It might buy us some time." As Declan adjusted the temperature settings, the plane shuddered violently again, throwing both pilots against their harnesses. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning illuminating the darkness in jagged bursts that made the aircraft feel even more fragile. Declan's jaw tightened as he fought to maintain control, his muscles straining against the yoke. Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him with crushing intensity. He glanced at Captain Hayes, who was pale but resolute, her hands steady on the auxiliary controls. "You're doing great," she said, though her voice betrayed her own fear. Declan nodded curtly, unwilling to acknowledge the compliment, or the possibility that they might not make it. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the drop in temperature was immediate and brutal. Passengers gasped as the cold air hit them, their breath forming visible clouds in the dim light. Some clutched blankets or coats, while others simply shivered uncontrollably, their bodies racked with coughs. The green vapor seemed to slow its advance slightly, its glow dimming as the chill took hold. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hope, a collective exhale from those still conscious. But it was short-lived. The plane lurched again, sending luggage tumbling from overhead compartments and eliciting fresh screams from the passengers. The mother holding her toddler rocked back and forth, whispering prayers into her child's ear, while the older woman clutching her rosary beads began to sob quietly, her lips moving silently in fervent supplication. Liam, still huddled in the galley, noticed the change in the vapor's behavior and felt a glimmer of relief. Maybe Declan's plan was working, or maybe it was just delaying the inevitable. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all his fault. "I should have refused," he thought bitterly, replaying the events that had led him here. The threats, the coercion, the promises of money. It all seemed so hollow now, meaningless in the face of the catastrophe he'd unleashed. He clenched his fists tightly, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to suppress the rising tide of guilt. Around him, the chaos continued unabated. Passengers crying, coughing, shouting, praying. It was a symphony of despair, and Liam felt like the conductor, orchestrating disaster with every decision he'd made. Declan, meanwhile, was running out of options. The descent was progressing as planned, but the plane's systems were failing faster than he'd anticipated. The navigation screen flickered intermittently, and the autopilot disengaged with a sharp beep, forcing him to take full manual control. "Come on, you piece of junk," he growled, wrestling with the yoke as the aircraft bucked and swayed. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the storm clouds that loomed ahead like a wall of doom. Declan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how much was at stake. He glanced at the altimeter again. They were close to a safe altitude, but not close enough. Another violent jolt sent the plane careening sideways, and Declan gritted his teeth, fighting to steady it. "Hold together," he whispered, though whether he was talking to the plane or himself he wasn't sure. Captain Hayes, sensing Declan's mounting stress, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We've got this," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise like a lifeline. Declan nodded, drawing strength from her calm demeanor. Together they worked in tandem, their movements synchronized as they battled to keep the aircraft aloft. Outside, the storm began to break, the clouds thinning slightly to reveal glimpses of open sky below. It was a small victory, but one that gave them hope. Declan adjusted the controls once more, guiding the plane into a smoother descent path. The cabin pressure stabilized further, and the green vapor's glow dimmed even more, its advance slowed by the freezing temperatures. For the first time since the crisis began, Declan allowed himself a fleeting moment of optimism. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot, but they were closer than they had been before. Still, he knew the hardest part was yet to come, landing the damaged aircraft safely amidst worsening weather conditions. As the plane descended further, Declan steeled himself for the challenge ahead, his resolve hardening with every passing second. Whatever happened next, he would face it head-on, using every ounce of skill and determination he possessed to bring everyone home alive. The plane's descent was a harrowing dance with disaster, each moment stretching into an eternity as Declan fought to keep the aircraft from spiraling out of control. The storm outside showed no mercy, its howling winds battering the fuselage and sending shockwaves through the cabin. Lightning illuminated the cockpit in brief, blinding flashes, casting sharp shadows across Declan's face as he gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. His mind raced, replaying every emergency protocol he'd ever memorized, searching for anything, any small detail, that might give them an edge. "We're approaching minimum safe altitude," Captain Hayes announced, her voice steady but tinged with urgency as she monitored the instruments. Declan nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the jagged outline of mountains loomed dangerously close. They were running out of sky. In the passenger cabin, the cold had become unbearable, turning breaths into visible clouds and freezing tears on cheeks. Passengers huddled together under thin blankets, their faces pale and drawn as they struggled to stay conscious. The green vapor still lingered, though its glow had dimmed significantly thanks to the freezing temperatures. It clung stubbornly to the ceiling, pulsating faintly like a dying ember. A young flight attendant moved through the aisles, checking on passengers and offering what little comfort she could. Near the rear, the nervous businessman sat slumped in his seat, his laptop forgotten on the floor beside him. His lips moved silently, as if rehearsing words he'd never get the chance to say. Nearby, the mother held her toddler tightly, rocking gently despite the turbulence. Her whispered prayers were barely audible over the chaos, but they carried a weight that filled the air around her. Liam remained in the galley, his guilt manifesting as a physical ache in his chest. He watched the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and helplessness, knowing there was nothing he could do to undo the damage he'd caused. Every cough, every scream, every sob felt like a direct accusation leveled at him. "This is your fault," his inner voice taunted mercilessly. He clenched his fist so tightly his nails drew blood, but the pain barely registered. Around him, the plane groaned and shuddered, its metal frame protesting against the strain of the descent. Liam closed his eyes, trying to block out the sounds of panic and despair, but they seeped into his consciousness anyway, haunting him. For a fleeting moment he considered confessing everything to Declan, to beg for forgiveness or at least understanding, but fear rooted him to the spot. What good would it do now? Back in the cockpit, Declan's focus was absolute, his body moving with mechanical precision as he adjusted the controls. The altimeter showed they were nearing the final stages of their descent, but the ground below was obscured by thick fog, making visibility nearly impossible. Declan squinted through the windshield, straining to catch any glimpse of the runway lights. Beside him, Captain Hayes worked tirelessly to communicate with ground control, her voice cutting through the static-filled radio. "Tower, this is Flight 427. We're coming in hot and blind. Request immediate guidance." There was a pause, followed by a crackling response. "Flight 427, we have you on radar. Cleared for emergency landing on runway 3. Winds are gusting at 35 knots. Proceed with caution." Declan exhaled sharply, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. At least they weren't flying completely blind anymore. As the plane broke through the cloud layer, the runway emerged like a lifeline in the darkness, its lights glowing faintly through the rain and mist. Declan's heart pounded as he lined up the approach, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The crosswinds buffeted the aircraft mercilessly, threatening to push them off course, but Declan countered with practiced skill, adjusting the rudder and throttle to maintain alignment. "We're almost there," Captain Hayes said, her voice softer now, almost reverent. Declan didn't respond. His entire being was focused on the task at hand. He glanced at the instrument panel one last time, ensuring everything was as stable as it could be under the circumstances. Then, with a deep breath, he committed to the landing. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, sending vibrations rippling through the cabin. Passengers screamed as the plane skidded along the wet tarmac, hydroplaning dangerously before finally regaining traction. Declan applied reverse thrust, his foot pressing firmly on the brakes as he fought to slow the massive aircraft. The screech of tires against pavement echoed deafeningly, blending with the wail of alarms and the roar of the engines. For a moment, it seemed like they might overshoot the runway, but Declan's instincts kicked in, and he made split-second adjustments that brought the plane to a halt, just shy of the grassy embankment beyond. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and muffled sobs. In the cabin, the initial shock gave way to a wave of relief so palpable it felt like a physical force. Passengers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces as they realized they'd survived. The mother kissed her toddler's forehead repeatedly, whispering, "We're okay," over and over again. Even the skeptical older woman lowered her rosary beads, her trembling hands clasped together in gratitude. But amid the celebration, Liam remained isolated, standing motionless in the galley as reality crashed down on him. He knew the danger wasn't entirely over. Not yet. Whatever authorities awaited them on the ground would demand answers, and Liam wasn't sure he had the strength to face them. Declan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as the enormity of what they'd just accomplished began to sink in. His hands trembled slightly as he released the controls, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away to leave behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Captain Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression a mix of pride and relief. "You did it?" she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. Declan shook his head, unwilling to take full credit. "We did it," he corrected, glancing at her briefly, before turning his attention to the task ahead. Ground crews were already converging on the plane, their flashing lights visible through the rain-streaked windows. Declan grabbed the intercom, his voice firm but gentle as he addressed the passengers. "Folks, we've landed safely. Please remain seated until the ground crew gives us clearance to disembark." As the passengers erupted into cheers and applause, Declan allowed himself a rare smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He knew the ordeal wasn't truly over, not while questions about the chemical reaction and Liam's involvement remained unanswered. Still, for the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. They'd made it this far against all odds, and that was something worth holding on to. The ground crew swarmed the plane like ants around a fallen leaf, their flashlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness as they assessed the damage and prepared to evacuate passengers. Declan unbuckled his harness and stood slowly, his legs stiff from hours of tension, his body heavy with exhaustion. He glanced at Captain Hayes, who was already on her feet, relaying instructions over the radio to coordinate with emergency responders. "We need hazmat teams on standby," she said firmly, her voice betraying none of the fatigue etched into her face. Declan nodded in agreement, his mind racing ahead to what came next. The green vapor still lingered inside the cabin, its faint glow now barely visible but no less dangerous. Whatever it wasn't something that could be ignored or brushed aside, not when lives were still at risk. Passengers began filing out cautiously, their faces pale and drawn, some leaning on each other for support as they stepped onto the wet tarmac. A mother carried her sleeping toddler, wrapped tightly in a blanket, while an older woman clutched her rosary beads, muttering prayers under her breath. Others moved in stunned silence, their eyes wide with the lingering shock of what they'd endured. Emergency personnel guided them toward waiting ambulances, where medics checked vitals and administered oxygen to those struggling to breathe. Despite the chaos, there was an eerie calm in the air, a collective exhale after holding their breath for so long. But amid the relief, Declan noticed something unsettling. Liam Carter hadn't emerged from the plane. Declan's stomach tightened as he scanned the cabin, his sharp eyes landing on Liam still standing near the galley, frozen in place. His expression was unreadable, though his clenched fists and rigid posture spoke volumes about the storm raging within him. Declan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his boots echoing loudly against the metal floor. "Liam," he called out, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's over. You need to come with me." Liam didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the glowing remnants of the chemical reaction spreading faintly across the ceiling. When he finally turned to face Declan, his eyes were red-rimmed and brimming with tears. "I can't," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of guilt. "Not after what I've done." Declan felt a pang of sympathy despite himself, though it did little to soften his resolve. "You don't have a choice," he replied evenly, taking another step closer. "Whatever you're carrying, whatever secrets you're hiding, they're going to find out anyway. Better you tell them yourself than let someone else piece it together." Liam flinched at the words, his shoulders sagging as if the fight had drained out of him completely. For a moment he looked like he might collapse, but instead, he straightened slightly, squaring his shoulders as if steeling himself for what came next. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines winding down. "But you should know, it wasn't supposed to be like this." As Declan escorted Liam toward the exit, the full weight of the situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The authorities would want answers, and Liam's confession, when it came, would likely raise more questions than it answered. Declan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye, though now wasn't the time to press for details. Outside, the cold rain stung his skin as he stepped onto the tarmac, guiding Liam toward a group of officials waiting nearby. Hazmat-suited technicians were already boarding the plane, their movements deliberate as they began assessing the extent of the contamination. Declan watched them work, his mind replaying every second of the flight, the arguments, the panic, the desperate measures taken to keep everyone alive. Captain Hayes approached him, her expression grim but resolute. "Ground control wants a debrief as soon as possible," she said, nodding toward a temporary command center set up near the runway. Declan nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. He glanced back at Liam, who was being questioned by two stern-looking agents, their voices low but insistent. Whatever Liam told them, it wouldn't undo the damage already done. But maybe, just maybe, it could prevent something like this from happening again. Declan sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face as he tried to process everything that had transpired. It wasn't just the flight itself that weighed on him. It was the realization of how close they'd come to disaster and how much farther they still had to go before finding closure. The debriefing was a blur of questions and answers, each word pulling Declan deeper into the aftermath of the crisis. Officials grilled him about the events leading up to the chemical reaction, probing for inconsistencies or overlooked details. Declan recounted everything as clearly as he could, relying on his photographic memory to fill in gaps where emotions threatened to cloud his recollection. Captain Hayes corroborated his account, her calm demeanor providing a steadying presence amidst the scrutiny. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that felt almost surreal given the night they'd endured. Exhaustion tugged at Declan's limbs, but sleep felt impossibly distant, his mind too restless to quiet. Back at the terminal, passengers huddled together in clusters, sharing stories and exchanging contact information as if clinging to one another could ward off the lingering fear. Some thanked Declan profusely as he passed, their gratitude genuine but overwhelming. He accepted their praise with quiet nods, uncomfortable with the attention, but unwilling to dismiss their sincerity. Among them was the nervous businessman, who extended a shaky hand and said, "You saved us all." Declan shook it briefly, his grip firm but brief. "Just doing my job," he replied gruffly, though the words felt hollow even to him. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the battered aircraft and the weary faces around it, Declan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. They'd survived against all odds, yes, but survival wasn't the same as resolution. Questions remained unanswered, tensions unresolved, and the shadow of what had happened loomed large over everyone involved. Declan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, for Liam, for the passengers, or for himself. But for now, they were alive. And sometimes he realized that was enough. The debriefing stretched on for hours, each question from the investigators peeling back another layer of the night's chaos, exposing raw nerves and unresolved tensions. Declan sat in a sterile conference room at the airport's administrative wing, his elbows resting heavily on the table as he recounted every detail with painstaking precision. His photographic memory became both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed him to recall events with clarity, it also forced him to relive them in vivid, unrelenting detail. Captain Hayes sat beside him, her presence steady but weary, occasionally interjecting to clarify or corroborate his account. The officials listened intently, their pens scratching against notepads as they pieced together the timeline of disaster. "And you're certain this substance was contained within the metallic case carried by Mr. Carter?" one investigator asked, his tone measured but probing. Declan nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. "Positive," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I saw it myself." Meanwhile, Liam was being interrogated in a separate room, his guilt laid bare under the relentless scrutiny of federal agents. He confessed everything: the smuggling operation, the threats that had coerced him into compliance, the warnings about the volatile nature of the chemical compound. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of the catastrophe that had unfolded aboard Flight 427, but it also raised troubling questions about oversight and accountability. By the time Liam emerged, escorted by 2 uniformed officers, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow with regret. Passengers who caught sight of him whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from anger to pity. Declan watched from a distance, his thoughts conflicted. Part of him wanted to confront Liam, to demand answers that went beyond what the authorities had extracted. But another part of him understood that the man was already paying a steep price for his choices. As the morning wore on, the terminal began to empty, passengers gradually dispersing after receiving medical clearance and logistical assistance. Some lingered longer than others, unwilling to leave until they'd expressed their gratitude, or their grievances, to those who had played a role in their survival. A young mother approached Declan, her toddler asleep in her arms, and thanked him through tears. "You gave us a second chance," she said softly, her voice trembling. Declan shifted uncomfortably, unused to such displays of emotion, but he managed a small nod. "Just doing my job," he murmured, though the words felt inadequate. Nearby, an older woman clutching her rosary beads stepped forward, her gaze piercing yet kind. "God works through people like you," she said simply before turning away, leaving Declan momentarily speechless. Back in the cockpit of the grounded aircraft, hazmat teams worked methodically to neutralize the remnants of the chemical reaction, their movements precise and deliberate. Declan stood outside, watching through the open doorway, as they dismantled the overhead compartment where the metallic case had been stored. The faint green glow was nearly extinguished now, its eerie presence reduced to a faint shimmer that seemed almost surreal in the harsh light of day. Declan's mind drifted back to the moments when the vapor had spread unchecked, threatening to consume everything in its path. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, and how quickly control could slip away. He clenched his fists briefly, the memory stirring a mix of frustration and resolve. They'd survived, yes, but only because they'd adapted, improvised, and relied on skills honed over years of experience. Declan realized then that his photographic memory wasn't just a quirk, it was a lifeline, one he'd need to embrace rather than dismiss. Captain Hayes joined him a few moments later, her expression softer now, the weight of responsibility easing slightly with the rising sun. "You handled yourself well back there," she said, nodding toward the debriefing room. Not everyone could have kept their cool under that kind of pressure. Declan shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise but unable to deny the truth in her words. "It's not about staying calm," he replied after a pause, his voice quieter than usual. "It's about knowing what needs to be done, and doing it, no matter what." Hayes studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. "Still," she said finally, "you should let yourself feel proud. You saved a lot of lives today." Declan didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky stretched endlessly, free of storms for the first time in hours. By midday, the immediate crisis had passed, but its ripple effects continued to unfold. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting footage of the damaged aircraft and interviews with shaken passengers. Headlines blared phrases like "miracle landing" and "hero pilot saves hundreds," though Declan cringed at the sensationalism. He avoided the cameras, retreating instead to a quiet corner of the terminal, where he could process everything without interruption. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers, offering thanks or admiration, but he ignored them all, focusing instead on the notebook he carried everywhere. Flipping it open, he began jotting down notes, not just about the flight itself, but about lessons learned, protocols that needed revisiting, and ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. Writing helped him make sense of the whirlwind, grounding him in facts rather than emotions. As the hours slipped by, Declan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, the heated arguments with superiors, the label of being difficult that had followed him throughout his career, the countless sacrifices made in pursuit of perfection. For so long, he'd believed his temper and uncompromising nature were liabilities, flaws that held him back from true success. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of a disaster narrowly averted, he saw things differently. His instincts, his memory, his refusal to settle for anything less than excellence, they weren't weaknesses. They were tools, assets that had enabled him to rise to the occasion when it mattered most. Declan closed his notebook with a sigh, feeling a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Maybe there was still room for redemption, not just for Liam or the passengers, but for himself as well. When Captain Hayes returned to check on him, she found him staring out a window, his posture relaxed for the first time in hours. "Ready to head home?" she asked gently, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Declan turned to face her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his voice. "Let's go." Together they walked toward the exit, the sunlight streaming through the glass doors, casting long shadows behind them. As they stepped outside, Declan paused for a moment, taking a deep breath of fresh air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear sky and the promise of new beginnings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He'd face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that sometimes survival wasn't just about skill. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the courage to keep moving forward. The days that followed the emergency landing blurred together in a haze of media interviews, regulatory hearings, and internal reviews, each demanding their own piece of Declan O'Shea's time and energy. Reporters camped outside his modest home, shoving microphones into his face whenever he dared to step outside for fresh air or groceries. "Hero pilot speaks out," screamed one tabloid headline, though Declan hadn't actually spoken to anyone beyond confirming his name and rank. He avoided the cameras as much as possible, retreating behind drawn curtains and locking the door against the relentless intrusion. Inside, the quiet was both a refuge and a reminder of the lives he'd saved, yes, but also of the fragility of control and the weight of responsibility that came with it. Captain Sarah Hayes called him regularly, her voice a steady anchor amidst the chaos. "They're calling you a hero," she said during one such call, her tone light, but tinged with knowing. Declan snorted softly, leaning back in his chair as he stared at the ceiling. "I'm no hero," he replied gruffly, though there was no real conviction in his words. "Just did what I had to do." Hayes chuckled on the other end of the line, her laughter warm and reassuring. "Maybe so," she conceded, "but don't underestimate how rare that is these days. People notice, Declan. They remember." Her words lingered long after the call ended, planting seeds of thought that took root in the quieter corners of his mind. Meanwhile, Liam Carter's fate became a topic of national debate. The authorities revealed details of the smuggling operation, painting a picture of coercion and desperation that complicated public perception of his role in the disaster. Some saw him as a villain, others as a victim, but Declan found himself unable to categorize the man so neatly. During the final hearing, Liam stood before a panel of investigators, his head bowed as he read a prepared statement. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice trembling but sincere. "I thought I could protect myself and my family by following orders, but I was wrong. And for that, I'll carry this guilt for the rest of my life." Declan watched silently from the back of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. When Liam glanced up briefly, their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment Declan saw not an antagonist but a man broken by choices he couldn't undo. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding, and that felt like progress. As the dust settled, passengers reached out to thank Declan, their messages flooding his inbox and mailbox alike. A young boy sent a crayon drawing of an airplane flying through storm clouds, its wings labeled Declan in shaky block letters. A mother wrote a heartfelt letter describing how she'd tucked her child into bed every night since the flight, cherishing moments she might have otherwise taken for granted. Each message carried its own weight, its own story of survival and gratitude, and Declan found himself reading them all, even when they brought tears to his eyes. For years, he'd prided himself on being self-reliant, on needing nothing and no one. But now, he realized that connection mattered more than he'd ever admitted. These strangers, bound together by shared trauma, had become part of something larger than themselves. And somehow, so had he. At work, things began to change subtly but significantly. Colleagues who had once dismissed Declan as difficult or temperamental now sought his advice, valuing his expertise in ways they hadn't before. Supervisors praised his handling of the crisis, offering promotions and commendations that would have thrilled him in another lifetime. But Declan surprised everyone, including himself, by declining most of them. "I didn't do this for recognition," he told his boss firmly, his green eyes sharp and unyielding. "I did it because it was my job. If anything changes moving forward, let it be better training, clearer protocols, and fewer corners cut. That's what matters." His words earned him nods of respect, though some still whispered about his stubborn streak. Declan didn't care. For the first time, he felt aligned with his principles rather than constrained by them. Weeks later, Declan returned to the skies, climbing into the cockpit of a newly assigned route with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The engines roared to life beneath his hands, familiar vibrations humming through the controls as he guided the plane down the runway. Beside him, Captain Hayes smiled faintly, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Feels good to be back, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Declan nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "It does." Outside, the horizon stretched endlessly, clear and bright under a cloudless sky. As the plane ascended, Declan allowed himself a moment of reflection, letting the rhythm of flight soothe the lingering echoes of turbulence. He wasn't the same man who had boarded Flight 427 weeks earlier, angry, isolated, convinced that the world owed him nothing. Now he understood that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes or rewriting history. It was about growth, about finding meaning in the storms and emerging stronger on the other side. When the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Declan leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply as he scanned the instrument panel. Everything was stable, predictable, exactly as it should be. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace, not because the danger had disappeared, but because he knew he was ready for whatever came next. Passengers in the cabin laughed and chatted, oblivious to the weight of the decisions made behind the closed cockpit door. Declan listened to their voices faintly, a reminder of why he flew in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but for the chance to make a difference, however small, in the lives of others. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the wings, Declan turned his attention back to the controls, his hands steady and sure. Whatever storms lay ahead, he would face them, one flight at a time,